Dr. Yosef Sokol is a licensed clinical psychologist and assistant professor at Touro College. He also oversees multiple clinical studies. Dr. Sokol and a research team have spent, I believe, years on a breakthrough study about marriage trends in the frum community. Yosef, Dr. Sokol, thank you for being here.
Thank you so much for having me. This is truly a pleasure.
Same here. We're going to get into a lot of the details of your study. 2 points jumped out at me about your research specifically. Number one, the vast majority, 96% of Charedi girls, according to your data, eventually get married. Now, many, it's in their 30s. That's a problem, but they do eventually get married. Number two, there are, according to your data, roughly the same number of boys and girls in the dating pool, specifically talking about the Charedi community right now, the yeshiva orthodox community. Is that accurate? And if so, doesn't that challenge a lot of our perception?
Well, that's a lot. So let me start with the
and feel free to take it slow. Loaded
Sure, question. Okay, so starting with that, the vast majority eventually are getting married. That does seem to be correct, which is really Baruch Hashem that people are, based on this data that we have, both men and women are eventually getting married. And as you noted, that it's happening way later than many people want. And I want to kind of reiterate this, and I'm going to probably reiterate this a few times. I'm not trying to say that we don't have a crisis.
Yeah.
We do. Just look around. People are in tremendous sorrow, tremendous pain. It's more that the data seems to show that people are getting married, and therefore the crisis is that people are having tremendous trouble getting married, and it's taking way longer than they would like. That does seem to go against a little bit of what people had thought is the problem. People had, which is actually kind of what sparked why I did this research. I'd been reading a lot of people talking about how chas v'shalom 10 or even 20% of from girls and yeshiva orthodox in our community are never going to get married. And I remember seeing, actually right before I started this, somebody say that once a girl reaches the age of 25, she's very unlikely to ever get married after that if she's not already married. And that struck me as being something that, if it's true, then yes, obviously we need to immediately do anything we can to fix that. But the reasons that people gave that they thought that didn't totally convince me. That whether it was based on a few yeshivas in Lakewood, that one thing that I remember, or it was based on numbers that they assumed about when were people getting married and the age gap between men and women. It seemed to me that if it's true, we really need to deal with this right away, but I didn't know if that was correct. And Baruch Hashem, I've been able to get some research skills. I have a PhD and I run different studies.
Yeah, a lot of research skills. I understand you being humble.
Any of it can shed light on this, any that helps us understand what to do better, I need to do that. So I looked around and I found Baruch Hashem, I was able to find a wonderful team of people to work with. Dr. Yitzhak Schechter, Dr. Naomi Rosenbach. Baruch Hashem, I was able to work with a group that Dr. Schechter has called ARC, Applied Research and Community Collaboration, which tries to do research in our community to work with the community to do that. And through a lot of help and hundreds of hours we all put into this, probably really thousands and thousands of hours, we ended up with this thing that, while there is definitely a problem, as everybody could see, but something that may present new ways for our community to be thinking about this. And obviously one study isn't the end. And we need more studies to kind of make sure that this is right and continue to, a lot of questions are unanswered. But this is, I think, a first step that Baruch Hashem, most people do get married. And it's not that there's so many more girls getting married than boys.
Yeah. And as you said, to clarify again, you're not saying there is no crisis in the sense you're redefining the crisis, in the sense you're redirecting how we should approach the crisis, because it's a very different crisis. If there is a boy out there somewhere and the girl has to find him sooner, that's very different than there aren't enough boys to match all the girls. So be very clear about that.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
I mean, if people are getting married, even when they're, unfortunately, sometimes even in their 30s and maybe even 40s, that doesn't mean there is a person that they are eventually going to marry. If we could figure out a better way to get them married to that person 20 years earlier, that would be a tremendous thing to do for our community. Right. That's a solution that only makes sense if they are eventually going to get married.
Right. Now, to your knowledge,
there's somebody for them, but it shifts the conversation.
And the flip side of it is,
sorry, what was that, Echo?
If the flip side of it is, if people are saying the solution is for boys to start dating younger, and we'll get to the age gap more in a moment, that theory, you're saying that won't really solve the problem, if your data is correct.
Right. I mean, what theoretically that might do is artificially increase the numbers of boys in the dating pool, but that's not the fundamental issue that there's not enough boys. There seem to be enough. It's the issue that these boys and these girls, although they exist in our community, are not getting married to each other.
Right. And just to
clarify, I'm happy to go into exactly. Sorry, what was that?
Yeah, we will. Now, to clarify one other point, as far as you're aware, is this the first time this sort of study has been done on this issue, like a real clinical study?
As far as I know, I wish there were more. I wish this wasn't the first. That I would be much happier that way. But the closest we have is this Pew review that came out, which in 2013, and then, or again, they had another one in 2020 that it was but way too small. Only had like 500 Orthodox people in it, but the numbers did match pretty closely to what I found. But it was way too small to really say anything particular. This is, as far as I know, the first and definitely the largest and most specific study to look at this area.
Okay, and let's focus on the age gap theory for a moment, as it's called, and how your research sort of challenges that. And I'll have you describe it if you can. In a nutshell, the idea is that in the Charedi world, boys tend to date girls and marry girls that are younger than them. So let's say a 23-year-old boy, not uncommon to marry a 20 or 21-year-old girl, maybe a 19-year-old girl, 24 and 22, etc. Not always the case, but that's the trend. And the idea is there's a population increase. So every year, presumably, there are more children born. So that means there are not as many 23-year-old boys in the dating pool as there are 20 or 21-year-old girls. Can you describe that? And why your research basically is saying that that's not correct? And then the question a lot of us have is, how could that not be correct?
Yeah, that's a great question. So just that the age gap hypothesis that we're assuming that because there's a community growth of approximately what we say is 5% a year, these people talk about this, and then there's what people say is a 4-year age gap. If you combine those two pieces of information, it makes sense that there should be more girls entering the dating pool and getting married available to get married than boys, which would create a problem. And yeah, I did not find that so much in that people did seem to be getting married, boys and girls are approximately the same level. So I'm to do the study if it's so obvious, and I came up with a bunch of possibilities. One is that I hypothesized that there's a smaller marriage age gap than people were thinking. So girls start at 19 and boys at 23 approximately, but maybe it's taking girls longer to get married than boys. And maybe overall the actual marriage age gap is smaller. And when I looked at the data, I have, I don't know, 5,000 people about approximately that I have that data about spouses and the age gap. And the answer for people who are yeshiva orthodox in our community, it was only about 2 years different. 2.2 to be exact, but that's less than 4. So that already cuts that whole model in half.
Right.
It just because you're dividing one of those variables by 2. And then as for the remainder of it, people who know this area know that if you look at the hospitals, and this is across all the developed countries, more boys are born each year than girls. That's how Hashem designed us. Like we have about 5% more boys born, and maybe it's because boys are more likely to die from different things, but whatever, I don't know Hashem's reason, but this is Lamaisa how it works. The more boys are born than girls. So that's another 5%. And then maybe the rest has to do with maybe there's people entering the system or leaving, people marrying people outside the system. I don't know the exact how it all kind of works, but it ends up being between the differences that people are saying it's 4 years and it's only 2, plus more boys being born. That seems to be enough that most of that issue apparently is not affecting and preventing girls from getting married. Does that make sense?
Yeah, look, I understand. I mean, definitely is, something which is puzzling, but, I'm not sure if the data, like I said, if the data is correct, then I guess we have to go in that kind of direction. Then the other question is the reliability of the data, which we're going to get to. Do you have backing support from Rabbanim?
Sure, that's a very important question, because without that, that's what our community, the Inya of our community, how our community should think about things through those eyes. And Baruch Hashem, throughout this, I have had. I was in Torah Tamima, and then I was in Brooklyn, where I became very close to Valley Burdney, and then after that, I've been in yeshivas of Shalom Shachter. Throughout my life, I've been in yeshivas, and throughout that time, whenever I've been thinking about issues in our community, I would talk to my yeshivas, my rabbanim. And this project which is one of many that I would talk about and think about. And Before I began this, whether I should do it or not, what I was doing exactly as far as how to get this information, what the information means, what the results mean, what are the next steps. All of these things are things I've talked to Rabbanim, Rosh Yeshivas about, and Baruch Hashem, I've had tremendous support along the way. If I didn't think that my Rosh Yeshivas and my Rabbanim thought that this was a valuable thing to do, I don't know if I would have done it, because what's the point of doing something that won't have an impact? It's because our Rabbanim and our Yeshivas think that this is valuable. That's why I think it can have an impact in our community, which is what this is all about.
Right. Obviously, very, very important. So let's get into your actual methodology, your actual data collection. Can you describe, how you ensured, obviously, that the data is reliable, and specifically, I think one thing that people will be wondering is it's based on self-identification. In other words, you had these two groups people identify as, I guess, modern Orthodox versus yeshiva Orthodox. Yeshiva Orthodox is the group that we're mostly focused on here, and where the age gap and the Shidduch Crisis discussion obviously gets a lot of focus, and people are going to wonder, well, how do you know, just because they identify as yeshiva Orthodox, which yeshiva? There are yeshivas, there's a big spectrum of yeshivas that people who are maybe in the more, call it modern Orthodox world, may identify as yeshiva Orthodox.
That's an interesting question. So I struggled with this, figuring out what the best way to have people identify as something. And I went through different options. I was thinking, at one point I was making a list of things like, do you send your kids to a co-ed school or not a co-ed or a single gender school? Do you wear your tzitzis out? I had a whole long list of possibilities, but then I took that whole thing and threw it away because it didn't work. It's very hard. Now, someday I will do this, but it's very hard to come up with an objective criteria to tell people what group they're in. And I think that as of now, the best way we had is by asking people what they identify, what group is closest to, they consider themselves part of. So I came up with a very simple, basic list, including Hasidish, Chabad, non-Orthodox, Yeshiva Orthodox, non-Orthodox. Of course, I also asked people, are they Ashkenazic, are they Sephardi? I asked people if they value tshuva or not. I asked people enough information to get a sense of which community they would kind of be in. Both also I asked them what they were raised in, what they are currently. And through all that information, if people said that they, instead of being Chabad, Hasidish, non-Orthodox, if they pick Yeshiva Orthodox, both that they were raised in that and that they still are in that, or there's somebody identified them that way, that's what I consider to be at least the closest I could get to this. And I just also want to note that I also struggle with what name to use. I thought about, should I use yeshivish? Should I use yeshivish? Should I use black hatter? Should I use Charedi?
Yeah.
Yeah. And each of those had problems. Like, just for example, I mean, personally, Charedi for me is an Israeli term. That's more about a society in Israel than a society in America. It doesn't, for me at least, it doesn't. I know a lot of people wouldn't really consider themselves Charedi, but are part of the yeshiva system. Yeshivish also. I know if people say that person's yeshivish, I'm not yeshivish, but they're part of the yeshiva system. Absolutely. It got a little confusing, and I thought that the simplest way to do it is just everybody sort of knows what I mean when I say yeshiva Orthodox, but as opposed to if I would use specific terms and divide it up in different complicated ways. So I ended up using that, and so far I haven't had anybody tell me that they had no idea and they gave up filling out the survey because they didn't know where to put themselves. It seems that if people pick yeshiva Orthodox or mono-Orthodox, that did seem to mean something.
And certainly, that's understandable how hard it is to find an objective criteria. Did you consider, what institutions they attended? So asking girls who are married, are they married to somebody who learned in BMG Lakewood or who learned in Brooklyn Yeshiva versus learning in Yeshiva University, and gauging it based on literally what institutions they're connected with? I
could have. And this is, again, I did consider that, asking what school you're sending your kids to, what school did you go to? But do you realize how complicated that would actually get and where you put the line? Yes, Yeshiva University is obviously not Orthodox, and BMG is obviously Yeshiva Orthodox, but the lines are blurry when you get down to the middle. And also, people sometimes learn to make both yeshivas. I know people who were in BMG and Yeshiva University both. What happens to them? Again, I could have a whole 3-hour-long conversation with all the different methods that I ended up not using.
Yeah.
And again, part of a team, not just me, we all work together to try to figure out what's the best way to do this.
And a team very familiar, obviously, with the community. And look, every study, you can always poke holes in
Yes.
the objectivity and in this kind of thing, the reliability. And that's why, people, like you said, you want multiple, you want more studies. So I completely,
Yes, 100%.
I completely understand that. But yeah, at the same time, I completely understand your point, how, you
Yeah,
literally,
maybe another, that would be great. Another study I would love for me to do another study that used more of these criteria, like kind of outside in, saying that I think you are part of, orthodox or Charedi, whatever, because X, Y, and Z, and see if it gets the same results. That would be great. But yeah, and you asked me before about like my overall way I got this data, and I could talk about that also for like an hour, but I'll give you like a 30-second version, and then
yeah,
ask me if you want more specific details about any part of that. So 30-second version is, again, went through many, many, many possibilities. And due to like what ended up, one of the major things that ended up deciding this particular method is because I was having a hard time getting like a list of people in the community from high schools or other places for whatever reason, politics or other issues. And it ended up being that I was going to have to get this data directly from the people. So the big issue with getting data directly from people is something called respondent bias or sampling bias, where a particular type of person is more likely to give you information. That's the big issue. And so I came up with a whole series of me and my team, a whole series of ways to deal with that. One of them is we created a very, very, very simple survey that people could fill out about themselves and their families. So their siblings, their children. And what we ended up doing is like asking, like, did they get married? How old they get married? Their gender, their community they're currently in. And then we ended up not using the people, what they wrote about themselves, because maybe there's something unusual about them, and just using what they wrote about their family members. Still, we have to make sure to reach as a large section of the community as possible. So we did a slew of different ways of getting this out. Including having like email blasts from marketing people, from yeshiva, the Yeshiva World News and Five Towns Jewish Journal both put it out, had an article that they had a link to this. We had the RCA sent it out to all their shuls, all the rabbanim sent it out to us, asked to send it out to the congregations. But actually, in my opinion, the way that worked the best was because when I actually looked at the numbers, is people who started filling it out, we asked every person, please send it to other people. And then if they gave an email address, we emailed them and asked them again. And people sent it to other people, and it became sort of viral on like WhatsApp groups. People kept inside, oh, I know a lot of seminary girls and a lot of yeshiva guys sent it to all of their friends, who then sent it to all of their friends, who then sent it to all of their friends. And that spread a lot through text messages, through WhatsApp. And that's why I think we ended up reaching a lot of people who don't even have internet access, because they're more Charedi, or if they do, they don't really use it that much. So that was another way to kind of reach a lot of different areas within that group. And even if one person doesn't have internet access, let's say one of their siblings might, maybe they have a sister who's part of a seminary WhatsApp group, and the sister filled it out for them. That was another way that we kind of reached people who we wouldn't have reached otherwise.
yeah, I was going to ask.
But there's an obvious problem with this because
yeah,
there is an obvious problem because if we have family members fill it out, then we have the issue: what if two people in the same family filled it out?
Right.
How do we know we're not double counting people? So so what we ended up doing is we included a list of questions that, while we can't identify who that person is because we wanted to keep it anonymous, we're able to identify if they're part of the same family, including the last 2 digits of the phone number of the family when they grew up, their zip code when growing up, number of siblings, genders, married or not, age at marriage. Then I use all of these things to identify duplicates in a single family and removed duplicates. So between that plus removing everybody outside of North America, we unfortunately didn't have enough information about Sfardim, Chabad, Hasidim to talk about them specifically. So I also removed those data points, which is why I went from information about over 15,000 people down to about 9,000 people.
9,000.
Which is why we only really talk about 9,000 people when I'm talking about this. That's because a lot of work went into cleaning this and making sure that it's representative of the community and non-biased as possible.
Now, but is there a concern that even though you're saying it reached people who don't have access to digital devices or internet, or don't have as much access, have limited access, because there's an email sent, because somebody shared it with their family, their friend, is there a concern that there's a predominance of people in the center, people who are going on Yeshiva World, or you mentioned the RCA? There's a lot of channels here that are kind of geared toward people who are more likely to be technology savvy or aware or involved. as opposed to, yeah, even if it happens to be that some of the more Haredim who don't, don't spend that kind of time on internet or are just not going, maybe some of them got it, but not nearly the same level of predominance. Is there a way to ensure that?
So again, great question. It's hard for me to like, am I going to say 1,000% sure that I'm certain that I reached every part of the community the same? Not really. And based on where people were that filled it out, like well, the locations of the people, based on the levels of that the areas that I know people got it from because I know people reached out to me. Also, based on that, I have found information about people, let's say in BMG or Lakewood, other people have collected it, and my data matches theirs almost perfectly. I'm pretty confident that this reached enough people in all these communities to be pretty representative. And just to add, even if there's some slight differences between different segments of Lakewood itself, let's say, it's all part of one shidduch system. In the yeshiva, so long as I'm reaching major aspects of the yeshiva orthodox world, it seems unlikely that it should be such a difference that, let's say, people who don't, let's say, have WhatsApp groups are much less likely to get married than people who do have. Like, we're talking about the community in a way that seems unlikely that small pieces should make a big difference in this question itself.
Yeah, that's a good point. You addressed this already, but just to follow, people have come up with the idea of just taking lists from seminaries, lists from high schools from 20, 25 years ago, and then just matching up, okay, where are they now? Why was that not an option?
It was an option. That was the first method I pursued, actually. That was like, for me, it was like, I was really going to get a full list of people from a single week. This is my first method, is get a full list of people from a certain year, let's say 20 years out, get a random sampling of those people, get information about those people and get it. The problem I hit is that it might maybe work for seminaries, but it was extremely difficult to get seminaries or high schools enough on board. But maybe now it's actually more likely because the community is more open to this, but also getting yeshivas was even more difficult. And because there's kind of less of a keeping track of people after leaving yeshiva. And I knew already that there's no way I could just look at girls and not boys. The whole question is there a difference between boys and girls? So just looking at girls without boys is just kind of not really a good method. I was planning on looking at everybody, and it got so difficult that I ended up moving to this method. But if someone is able to do that call-up vote, I fully support that. I'd love to be, that's something that would be wonderful to do.
Yeah, that's very interesting. Okay.
Again, multiple studies. I'm not saying anyone.
Right. No, exactly. Good answer. Now let's talk about which communities specifically are represented. And I know you asked people where they grew up, not where they currently are. I assume you did that because they're discussing family members. So, everyone's in a different spot right now. You showed me the breakdown. It's about 2,900 respondents from Brooklyn, about 1,500 from the Muncie area. And again, this is where they grew up, about 900, I think, from the 5 towns plus Far Rockaway. You have about 300 in Teaneck, about 300 in Lakewood. Again, that Lakewood, people have to realize Lakewood exploded in the last 12 or 15 years. So people who grew up in Lakewood 20 years ago, 25 years ago, that was a much smaller number. Those people grew up in Brooklyn. People in Lakewood now grew up in the New York area for the most part, I would think. That's my understanding. 180 in New York City. So I think it generally represents, people would argue, you targeted the areas where the people that we are looking at and are trying to understand, you pretty much hit those targets.
Yeah, and it's also worth noting that I got people from all over America. There are people from Los Angeles to Miami to Cleveland to Chicago,
Baltimore, Cincinnati.
Cincinnati, all over. Really, wherever there are like a frum community in America, larger than a few hundred people, somebody was filling this out, which is, for me, was very, very good. Like reinforced the idea that this is getting a sense of our community as a whole, not just any specific area in America.
Right. And now let's get to the actual, Shidduch crisis. Number one, as you said, there's way too many girls, according to your data. If your data is accurate, most girls are getting married, the vast majority by age 40. So there's a boy out there, presumably somewhere. Yet at the same time, I think it's 92% of girls married by age 30. So that's 8%. That's a very large number, only getting bigger, who are not married by age 30. I assume you would call that a crisis. I'd like to know. Number two, girls get married 25, 26, 27, 28. They could have gotten married at age 22 or 23. So do you agree? I know you said this earlier. Let's reiterate. Yes, there's a crisis, but the crisis, it seems, is that they're getting married too late. And if so, what do you think are the solutions? What is the right approach?
It's hard to say for certain anything about what a crisis is. I know there's tremendous pain out there. So many people who are really want to be married and are not married. And I know so many people are, this is why I was doing this. So without a question, I don't want this to be interpreted as saying this is not a crisis. That's not where this should go. And this suggests this study, and hopefully other studies following it, suggests another area for our community to be focusing. Because if it's true, which is pretty common, a certain percentage, then people are getting married. So we need to figure out just how to help them get married earlier. So that shifts. To get to that, then I needed this between my role as a researcher, which I've spent a lot of time, a lot of publications. I spent a lot of time on data. I know this is how I have a PhD. These are things I know how to do. And after the data is analyzed. So yes, I could talk about the data and say how confident am I in the exact numbers and why. But then what we should do about that, in some ways, is a little harder because I'm a member. I'm also a clinical psychologist. I'm a member of our community. So I have a lot of thoughts and intuitions, and a little bit is suggested by the data itself. But a lot of this is everybody has good ideas. It's not, I wouldn't say that I am should be necessarily taken any more seriously than anybody who really knows and cares about our community. Once they take into account that there are people out, eventually people are seem to be getting married. And the question is, how do we get to married earlier? Now, with those caveats, I do have ideas, just like probably everybody else. And some of them are suggested by data. So some things, I'll start with one that's kind of really a little bit actually in the data. If you zoom in on the data, you'll see that while the vast majority are getting married, until the age of about 30, 32, there are more girls than boys getting married each age year. But after that, it flips, and a 1% to 2% more boys than girls. If you're specifically looking at people who are raised and currently yeshiva orthodox, meaning that they're in our system, they stayed in our system. But why is that? And if I spent a whole bunch of different ways of looking at the data to figure that out. And one thing that popped out at me is that, unfortunately, for whatever reason, when people are 30 years old and not married in our community, they're not as likely to stay in our community. Maybe they leave to be modern Orthodox, they're Hasidish, Chabad, not Orthodox entirely. And for whatever reason, again, this seems to happen more to boys than girls. So really almost twice as many boys leave our system than girls when they are single at the age of 30. So why is this? I can guess, everybody else can guess too. It's very hard. Especially if you leave yeshiva and you're not married, people have a hard time staying connected, identifying and having a community, a home in our community. Right. And to me, at least, that suggests one way we could think about this is just from the data itself. Maybe our community, people are already doing this in Lakewood, figuring out people who leave yeshiva, how to connect them and stay involved. If we did more of that, especially people who are single, and figured out ways to keep them connected, the boys, over time, then every boy we keep in our community is another boy for a girl to be able to date and get married to. That's one for me, data driven. But there's other possibilities. For example, since these people are already in our system, but they're having trouble getting married, you have to think about what are they looking for in dating. What is their dating style? Are they able to build connections? Are they able to look while dating for what they should be looking for to get married and have a good marriage? And this is no tremendous chiddush or original idea, but if we did a better job at teaching people before they began dating what they should be looking for, this obviously should be based on hashkafas of the gedolim, of our rabbanim, maybe with also some data about what predicts good marriages. I'm happy psychologists do know a little bit about specifically what kind of might predict a good marriage or not, developing, getting married. But if we're able to help people ahead of time, then while they're dating, we have certified dating coaches that are our community trains people based on, again, Rabbanim's idea of what this should work, and maybe with consultation with people who are researchers, what could work to help people date and get married and also have good marriages. Obviously, we're not stopping by getting married. We want people to have shalom bayis, and we don't want to, that's what the long term is what we're looking for. So these type of things, and a lot of things along these way, how to encourage people to get married would be important. And I'm just going to reiterate, there's something that a lot of people say, my uncle always says this, he's a scientist, and he talks about the difference between is and ought. Science can tell us what is. It could say this is what's going on. Science can never say what ought, what should be going on. So I may be able to say, this is the number of people getting married. I even might be able to say, if I studied it, if you do X, Y, or Z, more girls will get married. Just to give an example, let's say I said that all mothers of boys should consult with the boy ahead of time and go based on what the boy wants in vetting the resumes. Theoretically, that may cause more people to get married. But should we do that? I can't say. That's an ought question. That needs to be hashkafa of our gedolim, of our rabbanim, to say what should happen, what we should do as a community. The best scientists can do is say, this is what's going on. This is what might happen if you do something. But that never says this is the solution that we should do. That is in the hands of people. But any does people who should be making that decision.
Right. And one last question: how do you respond if somebody says to you, "Look, I'm looking around. I know people. I know families. Like you said, there's a lot of suffering. I see more 30-year-old girls unmarried than 30-year-old boys. I'm looking. My perception is that there's more unmarried girls than boys. So what do you say to that? How do you? I think it's a common thought.
100%. Yeah, it was my thought too. It's everything. I mean, we look around. This is what we see, and there's a few parts to this answer. Excuse me if it takes a minute, because this is something I've thought about a lot.
I'm sure
it's a fundamental question. So I'm going to start with something called like a psychologist. I am a psychologist. We think about how people think and how people understand things and how people make sense of the world. One of the things that psychologists have discovered is something called an availability heuristic or an availability bias. The idea is that when we think about how common something is, we make that estimation based on how easily available examples are about them, rather than a true statistical analysis of the numbers. So for example, this is the standard example psychology textbooks use, is after there's a plane crash, if you ask people how common plane crashes are, people say, oh, they're very common.
Right.
But the reality is that only one happened in the past 3 years. But that example is very available in people's minds. And to give another example that's sort of near and dear to my heart, unfortunately, it seems like very often, the secular media, like the New York Times, whatever, publishes these hit articles about our community. And if you speak to people outside of our community, they'll say, oh, there's a lot of negative things going on. When the reality is, it's just because those are available in these people's minds, because that's what they're hearing. The 99.9% of our community is amazing and wonderful. But if newspapers publish and focus on all the negative things, and that's what people hear, then that's what is in people's minds, and that's what they assume is very common. So back to our case, if for whatever reason, I could talk about why this might be as a psychologist, researcher, but from girls who are yeshiva girls who are not married, it's extraordinarily difficult to them, and people notice that, and it's more available to them than the boys. And maybe it's kind of like you think of it as like it's terrible. Every time we see it, we think immediately, how can I help? And because there's tremendous pain. Is that really that the girls are more in more pain than boys? I don't know. It's hard for me to say. When I've talked to actually single, this is one of the reasons I actually got into this to begin with. When I talk to single boys and people who know, they say there's a ton of single boys out there too, but nobody talks about it. They say that it feels like nobody cares about us, which is really terrible, actually, for our community. Boys can be in pain just like girls can be in pain.
Yeah.
And if you look at my numbers, it looks like a lot of boys are not getting married too. But since there's an increased focus on this, it could be there's like that availability thing becomes activated and people notice that more. But actually, if you think about it, and we all think about it, we do know single boys too, who grew up in our community who are not married, most people. And if you actually think about it, and I actually did this myself when I was beginning this, I knew just as many of each. Somehow it was more obvious to me that the girls and the boys, because that's what I was thinking. So that's one. The next, that's an availability heuristic. Another part of this is that there is that actually over 30, remember, most people are getting married, the vast majority, and before 30, but let's say about 90%, whatever it is, at 30. But after that, there are somewhat a 2%, whatever it might be, more girls than boys who are not getting married, some more boys that are getting married. But as the numbers get smaller towards the end of the total amount, it ends up being there could be 50% more girls than boys unmarried who are over 32 or over 35, whatever it might be, who were both raised and currently yeshiva orthodox. So the whole number is maybe 5%. But in that 5%, there could be more girls than boys because, as I said, it looks like the boys might be leaving. The result is that you do know of someone more. So it's not just availability. It's like they're actually if you think about over 30, there are. Another point, and this is the last one I will stop after this. I can keep on going, but I'm going to do one more. There is a difference between the dating and the marriage. So I was talking before about the marriage gap, which is about 2 years, like in our community of yeshiva orthodox. between the actual, on average, the amount of years apart. But there's also a dating population group, and the amount of years on average that people what people date. And since there is a population growth, and there are and girls enter the dating pool earlier, there are a lot more girls than boys in the dating pool. Even though eventually they may date people at a bigger age gap, but for whatever reason, people end up marrying people closer to their age. So that, as far as marriage goes, can get rid of the issue of that there aren't enough boys for girls. But when you're in the dating, it looks like there are more. They are dating more. People are there's more kind of more available. Plus, there's the resume thing that boys get sent their resume first. Between those two things, it really feels like boys are having an easier time dating than girls. And girls are struggling, having a hard time finding dates, and are older. Combining all of those things, yes, it really does. It makes us even more, reinforces this feeling that there are so many more, the girls are having such a harder time, and there's so many more of them than boys.
Yeah.
I can keep on going on, but I think that 3 is enough.
All right, we'll leave it there. Yosef, Dr. Sokol, I really appreciate everything you've done. I appreciate you taking the time. Fascinating work, very obviously extremely valuable and critical work for our community. And it's fast. You've given us a lot to think about.
Excellent. Thank you. I just want to finish with one more point.
Final thought.
Final thought is that this is just the beginning. We need so much more. Our community needs help in this area. And I think we need to think this through, maybe do more studies, maybe do more methods and see if they work or not. This should really, I see this only as a preliminary first step. Our community needs a lot more help. This is a terrible issue. And I'm not saying that this issue isn't an issue. We need to help this issue.
Yeah. Okay. Dr. Yosef Sokol, I failed to mention earlier, you're a musmach of Yeshiva Beis Yosef in Brooklyn, licensed psychologist, assistant professor at Touro College. Thank you for joining us on the VIN Podcast.
Pleasure. Thank you so much for having me.